Thank you for joining me as I continue my examination of the book On Guard by William Lane Craig from my atheist perspective. In this video, we're going to cover Chapter 2 of the book, which is titled, What Difference Does It Make If God Exists? So let's get started. Craig recalls visiting St. Petersburg in Russia shortly after the fall of the Soviet Union, and while talking with famous Russian cosmologist Andrei Grib, name dropper, Craig asked about the large numbers of people who were turning to God in Russia at that time. Grib explained that perhaps those Russians were turning to God because their country had tried Marxist atheism for 70 years and it had failed, so they figured the opposite must be true. Now, to be fair, Craig is sharing this anecdote to set the tone for the chapter, not to make any specific argument, but nonetheless, I feel obligated to point out that the fall of the Soviet Union doesn't prove anything about the existence or non-existence of God. The fall of a government, whether that government is explicitly atheist or theist or non-religious, has nothing to do with the questions pertaining to the existence of God. It's a totally irrelevant subject. Is it possible that many people embraced Christianity after the fall of the Soviet Union because they viewed atheism as a failure and wanted to give religion a shot? Sure, that's entirely possible that people felt that way, but that doesn't make that a logically sound reason for converting to any particular religion. It's also possible that any increase in church attendance in Russia following the collapse of the Soviet Union was due to people who had been Christians all along now feeling more at liberty to practice their faith openly. Well, Craig says one of the problems with getting Americans to think about God is that unlike the Russians, who had lived under a godless regime all those decades, Americans take the existence of God for granted. They never stop to consider the implications of God not existing. And before they hear the evidence for why God exists, they should hear why it matters whether or not he exists. This is known as poisoning the well. Tell your audience how things would be so much worse if God didn't exist, so they will be more willing to accept that he does exist than that he doesn't. Craig says that the absurdity of life without God doesn't prove that God exists, but it does show that the existence of God is the most important question a person can ask. And Craig does claim that without God, life is absurd. Absurd meaning without ultimate meaning, value, or purpose in this case, because, of course, absurd can also mean that something is silly, ludicrous, illogical, all things which life can be at times, but I mean, isn't that what makes it fun? Here for the first time in this book, in this series, we encounter a popular apologist talking point, and one of which Craig is especially fond. Life has no ultimate meaning, value, or purpose without God. In other words, if an all-powerful, eternal, supreme being is not there to value something, it ultimately has no value. Apologists speak as though if something has no ultimate value, meaning, or purpose, then it has no value, meaning, or purpose, and any value which we might attach to it is merely an illusion created by ourselves, by our minds. And that's the point where I and many other non-believers differ fundamentally with apologists who make this argument. Because I don't claim that life or anything else has ultimate value. I agree that it doesn't, at least not in the sense that Craig is describing, but I don't care. I don't consider that to be a relevant observation. And maybe that's because the value God places in something, if he did indeed exist, wouldn't matter to me. It wouldn't matter to me whether he existed or not. Even in a universe where God existed in the way Craig imagines him, the concepts of value, meaning, and purpose would be unavoidably subjective. Just because God values something, that doesn't mean I have to value it. That doesn't mean anyone else has to value it, let alone everyone else. What God values is up to God. What I value is up to me. If I respect God, if I'm influenced by him, I might come to value something that he values because of the fact that he values it, but that wouldn't necessarily happen. Craig explains the difference between subjective and objective, noting that subjective is just a matter of personal opinion, while objective refers to something that is really there, as in an object in the exterior world, in reality. I find that a rather simplistic way of looking at those concepts, particularly for a professional philosopher, even one who is aiming his book at an audience of philosophical neophytes. He says that without God, the concepts of value, meaning, and purpose exist only in our heads. He calls them human illusions. Without God, life is objectively meaningless, valueless, purposeless. But with God, what is different exactly? With God, those concepts would still be subjective. They would still exist in our heads. They would still be subject to our own judgment and perceptions and experiences and priorities and tastes. The only difference would be the concepts would also exist in God's head and would be subject to His judgment, perceptions, experiences, priorities, and tastes. What is it that makes God's opinions on value, meaning, and purpose binding to everyone else? Is it because He's all-powerful? Is strength what determines whose opinions determine ultimate meaning? In that case, in the absence of God, would the most powerful mortal person or organization or what have you be entitled to call its opinions on value, meaning, and purpose the ultimate forms of those things? I doubt Craig would agree. The argument seems to be that there is something unique about God, something special that makes His values, His meaning, His purpose, the ultimate forms of those things, the correct forms of those things, the real forms of those things. But I've never heard anyone offer a coherent explanation of how that works. Apologists usually just say, well, He's God in some form or another, as though that statement alone should resolve all confusion. It doesn't. Here's the thing. If I value something, I value it. It matters to me. If we value something, we value it. It matters to us. If our community or our nation or even the entirety of the people of the world all value something, then we all value it. It means something to us. If there is a God and it means something to Him too, great. If it means something else to Him than it does to us, great. If it means nothing to Him, great. If there is no God for anything to mean anything to, great. It doesn't make a difference. Do Christian parents who become atheists cease to value their children? I mean, after all, if God doesn't exist, then value and meaning don't ultimately exist, and therefore their children don't really have any value. Right? I mean, why value your children when you know your sense of their value is just an illusion in your mind? It doesn't make any sense. Of course, that's absurd. Whatever your religious beliefs may or may not be, you don't value your children or your parents or your siblings or your friends or anyone or anything else because God tells you they're valuable or because God exists somehow magically imbuing them with value. You value them because they mean something to you, because you have imbued them with value in some way. And when we speak of things having an innate value, when we say that life itself has a minimum value, that people have certain basic rights, the right to live and to be free from unnecessary suffering at the very least, that's us agreeing with each other that we value something again. We don't need God to do that. We'd do it whether God existed or not. Or most of us would, anyway. Well, Craig attempts to explain why life without God is absurd, that is, without value, meaning, or purpose. He writes, quote, "If God does not exist, then both man and the universe are inevitably doomed to death. Man, like all biological organisms, must die. With no hope of immortality, man's life leads only to the grave. His life is but a spark in the infinite blackness, a spark that appears, flickers, and dies forever." So, ultimate value lies in immortality, at least in part, according to Craig. And, you know, it strikes me that that thing he's describing in that quote, a spark in the infinite blackness that appears, flickers, and dies forever, I think he intends to make that sound futile, to make it sound meaningless. But I take it exactly the opposite. And I think a lot of people would view that in exactly the opposite way. If it is indeed a mere spark that flickers just for a moment and then disappears forever, that doesn't make it futile or meaningless. That makes it precious. That makes it one of the most precious things there can be. It only exists for a short time, and if you are somehow involved in it during that short, brief flicker of existence, then you have been given a great privilege. That's how I look at it. I don't know. Craig continues, quote, "And the universe, too, faces a death of its own. Scientists tell us that the universe is expanding and that galaxies are growing farther and farther apart. As it does so, it grows colder and colder as its energy is used up. Eventually, all the stars will burn out, and all matter will collapse into dead stars and black holes. There will be no light, there will be no heat, there will be no life. Only the corpses of dead stars and galaxies, ever expanding into the endless darkness and the cold recesses of space, a universe in ruins." And at the top of the page following that quote, Craig insists, this is not science fiction. This is really going to happen unless God intervenes. And really going to happen is italicized. He means that. He wants you to get that point. You don't want that to happen, do you? You'll die. Your loved ones will die. Eventually the entire universe will die. That sounds pretty grim to me. How about you? We'd better hope God is around to intervene, huh? Does this well water taste poison to you? Again, Craig says that without God, without the hope of immortality, life has no ultimate meaning. And again, I say, so what? Immortality is not an option, as it turns out, at least if you believe as I do, that there is no God and that all biological organisms are mortal and there is no spiritual existence. There's only a natural universe, not a supernatural one beyond this one. If you believe that, as I do, then immortality is just not in the cards. It's not an option. I've seen no evidence whatsoever that should compel me to believe that it is an option. And while I certainly don't look forward to death, quite the opposite, in fact, I also don't expect that the universe owes me a reality that operates according to my preferences. We live, we die, it's sad. We might dearly wish that life didn't have to come to an end, but we might also wish that life were better than it is in many other ways. We might wish that life were more full of joy and less heartache, full of more fulfillment and less disappointment. And just as it is with value, meaning, and purpose, all these concepts are subjective. What constitutes a better life depends on the individual. Not everyone wishes for immortality, be it a physical or a spiritual kind of immortality. Some people just are downright chilled at the concept, at the prospect of living forever, no matter what the nature of that eternal life might be. If I were to say, well, life has no meaning without immortality, I might as well say life has no meaning if I can't breathe underwater. Or life has no meaning if I can't sunbathe on the surface of Pluto. If I know going in that those aren't options available to me, why should I anchor my concept of meaning to them? Why do I say life has no meaning without immortality, when immortality is not a part of life? A rose isn't precious because it's immortal and indestructible. In fact, its mortality and fragility are the very things that make it precious, beautiful, desirable in the minds of many people. That's why naturally grown flowers are considered a superior product to plastic flowers. Yes, they're delicate. They require care. They don't last forever. Therein lies their value. In the opinion of some, they have no ultimate value, but who the hell said they had to? The concept of ultimate value, in the sense that Craig seems to mean it, is nonsensical. But we need more than immortality for life to be meaningful, Craig says. Mere duration of existence doesn't make that existence meaningful, he writes. Immortality without God would still be without ultimate significance. And that's just the start of your troubles, you godless bastards, quote. But the problem becomes even worse. In a world without God, who's to say whose values are right and whose are wrong? There can be no objective right and wrong, only our culturally and personally relative subjective judgments. Think of what that means. It means it's impossible to condemn war, oppression, or crime as evil. nor can you praise generosity, self-sacrifice, and love as good. To kill someone or to love someone is morally equivalent. What the hell is he talking about? If no God means that there is no objective morality, then how can Craig say that to kill someone or to love someone is morally equivalent? How can he say it's impossible to condemn war, oppression, or crime? These are very sweeping statements and very absolute. They certainly don't sound like matters of personal opinion. In fact, Craig seems to be saying that in a world without God, personal moral opinions would be impossible, or at least meaningless. But doesn't that sound a lot like he's describing things in terms of objective morality? It sounds that way to me. How can you say, without objective morality, killing someone and loving someone are morally equivalent? That is a moral statement. But if you're saying there has to be an objective morality for moral statements to have meaning, and you're also saying there is no objective morality, doesn't that make the statement killing someone and loving someone are morally equivalent meaningless? Checkmate, theists. Craig turns to the question of purpose, and he makes the same point he's already made about value and morality. If there's no God, and if nothing lasts forever, then life has no ultimate purpose. He writes, if destiny is a cold grave in the recesses of outer space, the answer must be yes, it is pointless. When Craig and other apologists make these sorts of declarations, I think they reveal more about themselves than anyone or anything else. As I've said a few times already, it doesn't trouble me that life has no ultimate purpose. I don't expect it to. I don't consider that to be even a valid concept. My understanding of the concept of purpose precludes there being any such thing as ultimate purpose. Purpose, in this context, is a subjective matter. What's the purpose of my life? What's the point? It depends. Does the fact that my life will end someday mean that it can't possibly have any point? Of course not. Not to me, anyway, and I think I should have some input on the matter. What's the point of playing Major League Baseball? It depends on who you ask. Some might say the point is to make a lot of money. Some might say the point is to play the game as best you can, to excel. Some might say the point is to beat your team's most hated rivals. Some might say the point is to win the World Series. So let's say you and I agree that the point of playing Major League Baseball is to win the World Series. But there's a World Series every year. You win the World Series, but that victory doesn't last forever. You have to start over the next season, and you might not make it to the series again. Your victory in the series last year means nothing this year. So what's the point? Most baseball players, hell, most baseball fans would not say that baseball is pointless because World Series championships are annual deals that don't carry over into the next season. Most boxers wouldn't agree that their sport is pointless because even if you win the World Championship, someday you will inevitably have to lose it. This just isn't how any of this works. By insisting that things which don't last forever are pointless, by stating that as though it were a self-evident fact, Craig is either revealing what a bleak nihilistic worldview he has or revealing what a cynic he is. Because if he doesn't honestly believe that life is necessarily pointless without God, he's at least presenting it in those bleak, hopeless terms in order to persuade his audience that they should believe in God in order to avoid living in such a bleak, hopeless world. Craig writes, quote, I hope you begin to understand the gravity of the alternatives before us. For if God exists, then there is hope for man. But if God does not exist, then all we are left with is despair. Unfortunately, most people don't realize this fact. They continue on as though nothing has changed. The problem is, that's not a fact. It's a matter of perception. It's a matter of opinion. I'm telling you, as an atheist, as someone who does not believe in God or immortality or ultimate meaning, value, or purpose, that I am not left with nothing but despair. That may be the case with some folks. Some atheists may feel that their lives are pointless. They may live in despair, and if so, their feelings and their view is completely valid. That's just how they look at things. That's how they feel. But it's not my view. And it's not the view of a lot of other people. It's not the view of a lot of you watching this video who are atheists, I'm sure. Craig doesn't explain why this is a fact. He declares, without God, we're left only with despair and life is pointless. In other words, if someone doesn't believe in God and they believe life is absurd and pointless and nothing but despair, they're right. But if someone doesn't believe in God and they believe life is rich and meaningful and fulfilling, they're wrong. But Craig never demonstrates why the former is right and the latter is wrong. If God exists, then there is hope for man, he writes. Why? What if someone doesn't believe in God and they're glad God doesn't exist? What if they are dismayed at the prospect of eternal life, be it spent in Craig's conception of heaven or hell or somewhere else entirely? What if they're comforted by the knowledge that someday their life will be complete? What if they derive meaning from playing their role in the ongoing cycle of life and death? Are they wrong? Are they wrong because Craig can't imagine someone having that view? Does it boil down to that? I can't conceive that anyone would actually think that, therefore no one actually thinks that? It seems like a rather arrogant attitude to me. After going over all of his material yet again, for some reason, Craig concludes that without God, we are forced to live in self-deception in order to have happy lives. In other words, we know that life has no meaning, point, or value, but we pretend that it does. If you, like me, are beginning to suspect that Craig is talking about himself here, you're right. He tells us so in one of the final sections of the chapter, which is subtitled My Story. Craig writes of how empty his life felt before he found God. As a teenager, he writes, he felt deeply the meaninglessness of life and the despair that it brings. When he first encountered Christians, he resented them. They seemed so happy, but he couldn't accept that they weren't just pretending. He believed that everyone was just as empty inside as he was, and people who seemed to be happy and fulfilled were just putting on a mask to hide the despair that they carried within. Then one day, while he was in high school, one of his fellow students told him that she was saved, and that's why she was so happy all the time. And she explained to young Bill, that's Dr. Craig, professional philosopher, okay? Young lady, maybe, I don't know, maybe she could call him Bill. She explained to him that there was a difference between going to church and saying you were a Christian and actually letting God into your heart. And if you want the good stuff, you need to get saved. You need to let God into your heart, and God will do that. He will save you because he loves you if you ask him just the right way. Anyway, young Bill was amazed that God could love someone like him. He writes that he was amazed that God could love a lowly worm like him. Boy, he was a teenager, wasn't he? But he read the New Testament, he learned about the teachings of Jesus, and then he met with other Christian students, and eventually he gave his life to Christ. And it was a momentous time in his life. He cried, he felt a great rush of joy inside him, and then he ran outside and he looked up at the stars and he thought to himself, God, I've come to know God. Splendid. It's interesting, though, that Craig apparently never changed his view that other people can't possibly see the world any differently than he sees it. Since he felt empty and hopeless when he didn't believe in God, therefore everyone else who doesn't believe in God must feel that way too. And more than that, it's a fact that a world without God would necessarily be meaningless and full of despair. He can't imagine any other circumstance. He felt that way before he was saved, and he thought happy people were just putting on a mask, and he feels that way now after he's been saved for many, many years. Only now he does allow for the exception that Christians who truly know God are happy, are really truly happy. Everyone else, though, they're just pretending that their lives have meaning when in reality it's all pointless and everybody knows it. Craig writes, quote, Biblical Christianity thus challenges the worldview of modern man, for according to the Christian worldview, God does exist and life does not end at the grave. Biblical Christianity therefore provides the two conditions necessary for a meaningful, valuable, and purposeful life: God and immortality. Why are those the two conditions necessary for a meaningful, valuable, and purposeful life? Why is life without both of those conditions necessarily meaningless, valueless, and purposeless? Craig never says. If his argument were stated in logical form, it would look something like this. 1. There are two necessary conditions for a meaningful life: the existence of God and immortality. 2. Biblical Christianity teaches that God exists and immortality is possible. 3. It is a necessary consequence of atheism that God does not exist and immortality is not possible. 4. Therefore, a meaningful life is possible under the Christian worldview and impossible under an atheist worldview. Craig himself doesn't present the argument this way in the book, but I think his point in this chapter can be broken down and fairly expressed in this way. And please, dedicated logicians watching this video, check my thinking on this and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that is a logically valid argument and a fair way of stating what Craig is saying in this chapter. The problem is, Craig has made no attempt at all so far to show why it's a logically sound argument. Why are his premises true? And the big problem there is premise number 1. There are two necessary conditions for a meaningful life: God and immortality. Why is this true? Craig offers no evidence. He offers no reasoning. He simply states it as if it were a self-evident fact. He spends a lot of time going on and opining about why life without God and without immortality would necessarily lack true meaning. And he doesn't demonstrate why that is true either, but he never explains why life with God and immortality would be meaningful. Craig writes, quote, "If God does not exist, then life is futile. If God does exist, then life is meaningful. Only the second of these two alternatives enables us to live happily and consistently. Therefore, it makes a huge difference whether God exists. By sharing the absurdity of life without God, I only hope to have gotten you to think about these issues, to realize that the question of God's existence has profound consequences for our lives, and that therefore we cannot afford to be indifferent about it. If we can achieve that much in sharing with an unbeliever, we are well on our way." Well, speaking only for myself, I must say that he has failed in convincing me that the question of God's existence has profound consequences in the way he's describing. I accept that the existence of God would certainly have some profound consequences. It would greatly affect the way I conceive the universe, but would it change my concepts of value, meaning, and purpose? I don't think it would. Craig chose to devote this entire chapter to those concepts. He chose to argue that the existence of God is consequential, is in fact the most consequential question there can be, by focusing on how it affects those concepts. And while I'm grateful that he didn't try to argue that the existence of God makes a difference because if God exists and you ain't saved, you're going to hell, I am left with the feeling that from where I stand, this whole chapter has been pretty pointless. Craig asserts over and over again, without evidence or reasoning to back up his assertions, that life in a godless universe is meaningless, absurd, futile, but life in a universe with God is exactly the opposite: meaningful, valuable, and purposeful. And he's definitely convinced me that it's important to him whether or not God exists for those reasons. I believe that he believes that without God life is meaningless, but he's given me no reason why I should believe that. I doubt most of his readers will see this problem. As mentioned in the previous video in this series, Christian apologetics, in my opinion, is not written for non-believers, but for believers. And most people who are already Craig-type Christians will nod along in agreement when they read that life without God is meaningless. Many of them have probably been taught that all their lives. But to someone like me, who reads the book without the presupposition that God is a necessary factor for a meaningful life, this just sounds like someone repeating his personal opinion over and over and insisting that I should agree with him without bothering to offer any reason why. Recall the beginning of this chapter, when Craig shared what he believes is one of the major problems in getting people to think about God, which is that they never stop to consider the deeper implications of the existence or non-existence of God, because they simply take him for granted. Well, Craig was right. His only error was that he failed to include himself in that group, because that's just what he does in this chapter. He doesn't tell me why life without God is meaningless. He doesn't tell me why life with God is meaningful. He just says that it is and takes for granted that I'll agree with him. Well, I don't. And that's not a problem for me, but it is a problem for him. Well, that's it for Chapter 2. I will be back next week to continue this series with a look at Chapter 3 of On Guard, which is titled, Why Does Anything at All Exist? I'm sure that's going to be some classic Craig. Get ready for some cosmological argument, for some teleological argument, for some argument from morality, for some fine-tuned universe, for all the classics of why does the universe exist? Why is there something instead of nothing? That's all going to come in the next chapter. I believe. I haven't actually read the chapter, but I'm guessing that is where he will go. So that's it for this episode. Thank you all so very much for watching. As always, if you have anything to say about what I have had to say here, if you think I got something right and you want to say good job, if you think I got something wrong and you want to say, hey, dipshit, here's what you should have said. If you have anything to say about anything that I have had to say, whether you are an atheist or a Christian or some other category of belief or non-belief, I would be very interested in hearing what you have to say. So please do leave a comment below. And also, please remember that I make these videos and I'm able to produce all of the content I do on these channels thanks to the support I receive from my very generous patrons. And if this work that I do means something to you, I would ask if you can afford it and if you think I'm worth it to become one of those patrons by going to patreon.com/SteveShives and supporting this channel for a monthly donation. It can be as little as $1 a month, or you can contribute more if you think I'm worth it and you can afford it. But even those $1 a month pledges make such a huge difference in my life and really allow me to do what I do. So thank you to all of you who are patrons. Thanks to all of you who might become patrons in the near future. Thanks to all of you for watching, and I will see you in the next video.